Now, today's topic is Misunderstandings of Stoicism 101, which my guest and I will try to cover in an hour, although it could take probably, half a day easily. But, we'll get started and then we'll see what we get. And my guest is, in fact, Greg Sadler, who is the editor of the Stoicism Today blog. He's also the president and founder of Reason.io, a company established to put philosophy into practice, providing tutoring, coaching, and philosophical counseling services, and producing educational resources. He works as an executive coach and ethics trainer for priority thinking and produces the half-hour Hegel series because, as it's well known, you can't take more than half hour of Hegel. In fact, that's pretty brave right there. Greg, welcome to the show, because at this point, I'm going to call it a show.
Yeah. Well, I think this is going to be a great conversation because this is something that we've kicked around as ideas in other forums, like in Twitter, when we've managed to meet up face-to-face, usually involving Stoicon of some sort or another. And I know that it's something that because you have a bit more of a large footprint in the digital media, I think you encounter these things a bit more than I do, but I get my fair share of them as well. And I know that some of our guests, because I see their names, have also had to explain some of these things to other people as well. Right. So I think it's actually
so let's
go ahead.
No, let's get started. So what I wanted to remind our audience is that this is going to go on for about an hour. If we go a little over, who cares? It's the internet. But more or less, that's the general idea. Greg and I are going to start. We have a list of subtopics for today. We're going to get started. At some point, we're going to open to Q&A. We may open a Q&A in the middle of our conversation. I think once we hit one or 2 points, then we're going to open it, and then we'll see what happens, and we'll go back to our list of topics. It's all improvised. So, Greg, the first one is Stoicism with a little s versus Stoicism with a big S. So what's that all about?
There's a couple good articles on that. I think you may have been one of the people who wrote them a while back when we were really encountering this a lot. You see it in like the Facebook discussion groups or the Stoicism Reddit, where people are asking questions about Stoicism, and they use a little s, and they're usually saying things like, well, Stoicism means keeping a stiff upper lip or suppressing my emotions. And there's a whole host of things that people associate culturally with Stoicism. And, there's good historical reasons for that we could go into later if people are really interested in. But those, the long and short of it is those sorts of attitudes or perspectives or psychological traits, those aren't the same thing as Stoicism with a capital S, which is the actual philosophy and the practices that go along with it. And there, like I said, there's good historical reasons why this blurring has happened. I don't know that they help us that much in the present, where we constantly have to explain this. Right. And it is go ahead.
The interesting thing is, I think it was, I may be mistaken, but I believe it was John Sellers actually who pointed this out in one of his books, that most of the Hellenistic philosophies, their names had made it into the English vocabulary, and all of them are distorted, right? So Epicureanism has become sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Cynicism has become, this
sneering at things.
Skepticism has become, I don't believe anything, no matter what you say. Stoicism is the stiff upper lip. So all of them is kind of made it into the vocabulary, but in all cases, there is a trace of, a little bit of truth, because it's true that the Cynics were in fact sneering at people. They were telling them, "Hey, you're not virtuous, my friend. What's up with you? What's up with that kind of thing?" I mean, Diogenes is a classic example, right?
And that actually kind of points towards something. So if you look at what we know of the Cynics, because unfortunately we don't have most of their writings, right. There was a point to what they were doing. They weren't just being jerks to people to be jerks to people. They were the heralds of God, as Epictetus says, right? So there was some sort of object lesson that was being presented to other people, and there was some sort of thing that they were doing to themselves. You know, by the way, I really liked when we had Margaret Graver as the Stoicon speaker, and she talked about the Cynic
Right.
approach to the emotions as trying to sort of harden one's shell. I think she's completely right about that. And so they weren't just being, you know, I don't know, what would you call them today? What would be the synonym? Not just jerks, but kind of hipster jerks, you know?
Hipster jerks, that's right. Virtuous jerks.
Yeah, yeah. But so, yeah, I mean, we could say a similar thing with Stoicism. Yeah, okay, sometimes there is not showing your emotions, but what's the point of that? Is it to just like control your emotions and show what a tough guy you are? Or is it to try to rework your life so that your anger or anxiety or fear isn't, you know, leading you into doing dumb things that then cascade into yet dumber things and make your life more miserable?
Right. So should we talk a little bit about Stoicism and emotion then? So what is the proper actual, you know, Stoic way of approaching the emotions?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings of Stoicism. And it comes about because of this lowercase s Stoicism thing. You know, the Stoics, I mean, we can say two things. One is, okay, they did distinguish between what we can call bad emotions and good emotions. And then a lot of people, there's good emotions. Well, yeah, you know, rational fear, which is caution, and rational joy and rational desire. They didn't see any sort of rational pain in that fourth quadrant, but you know, I think we could debate that. Maybe Seneca has some room in there for properly grieving when things happen.
That's right. It does, yeah.
And you know, we've talked about this before. Like, love is an important thing for Stoics. Affection. Epictetus talks quite a lot about philostorgia, which is the kind of affection we feel towards those who we're close to. And you know, then
and even
there's
a sense of joy, right? I mean,
yeah.
Seneca at some point in one of the letters to Lucilius says, you know, if there is one thing that you need to do is to develop, you know, learn to feel joy. So it's like, come on.
Yeah, and Marcus is constantly stressing that too, I think, you know. So that's like a consistent Stoic doctrine from what we can tell. And then, you know, there are bad emotions. Bad, not in the sense of like, you know, we should look down our nose on them and say, oh,
right.
you're, you know, you've lost your temper, therefore, you know, the whole world is falling apart. But they're, you know, they're non-productive. They damage us in some ways. And so, you know, the Stoics place all forms of anger in there. But, you know, irrational grief, where people are like, you know, we see this in movies. Somebody dies, and now you push everything off the table, and you know, slam doors and, you know, break things. Well, that doesn't do any good for anybody, like least of all the dead person. And we could go on and on about that. But even with so the second thing is, you know, after we make this distinction, even when we're feeling these emotions that are problematic, that the Stoics called the passions, the pathe. It doesn't mean that all is lost. You know, when we have an emotional response, we can look at the emotion, and we do have some measure of control. Habits often, you know, they come to help us, but they also disable us sometimes along the line. But we can look at the emotions as things that have to be transformed, you know, that we can pick apart and see the judgments that are involved in it, or the assumptions that are involved, and the automatic lines of reasoning and thinking. And then, you know, maybe we can't get ourselves to the point, like if you're me, where you're never angry, but you can, you know, do what Epictetus says and like, don't get angry for a day and then keep track of that.
That's right.
So.
Yes, exactly. Never getting angry or upset. It's really, I mean, we're not sages, right? I mean, that's the thing. But if you, the notion is to try to move. So the way I have come to visualize or sort of conceptualize what the Stoics are getting at, or at least what is a reasonable modern interpretation of what a Stoic should be getting at. Because, you know, that's the other thing. We don't need to be stuck. You know, Epictetus is now scripture, and just because Epictetus says so, it doesn't mean that we have to do it as well. But I think a reasonable interpretation is something on the lines of the shifting the emotional spectrum away from the kind of emotions that is disruptive to our lives, the kind of emotion that takes over reason and makes you do things that are disruptive, you know, negative, and that you're going to likely regret, and moving away from that and moving toward and cultivating positively the kinds of emotions that, on the other end, are more in agreement with reason, meaning that are the kind of things that it's reasonable to do, that it's good to feel in a certain way.
You know, and you use an emotion word there that I think there's also misunderstandings of: regret. And so, you know, should we feel regret at all? Ideally, no, right? But that would be because we'd never screwed up in the first place. And so, you know, feeling regret, if we allow that to become irrational and we're like, oh, I'm so terrible, nothing is ever going to be good for me, that's not productive. But, you know, it probably is helpful for us to feel some of these negative emotions. You know, even anger at oneself sometimes could be helpful, I think, when, you know, you realize what a screw up you are. And you're like, man, I need to fix this. Or getting angry at... Oh, go ahead.
In fact, Seneca says that you simply cannot avoid feeling anger. I mean, that's another place that I point people to when they say, "Oh, you guys are trying to suppress emotions." Like, no, Seneca says right there, you cannot. It cannot be done. What you do want to do is to avoid acting on the basis of anger. While you are angry, you should not act. You should disengage. You know, take a walk, deep breathing. You know, count to 20. Whatever works. Get a martini, you know, whatever works, and that works for me, for instance. And then when you come out and say, okay, now let me engage you. What the hell was going on there? Because sometimes the anger, as you were just saying, is in fact indicative of something going on that we should be paying attention to. Sometimes we are, you know, angry either ourselves or at some injustice that we've seen or something like that. That is not a bad thing. It's what's bad is acting on the basis of anger while you're angry. That's the problem.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, and I like that distinction between suppressing, which is what people claim Stoics are doing, or people claim themselves as Stoics are doing, and disengaging and then re-engaging in such a way as to try to understand what's going on with me.
So, but now we started this conversation talking about little s Stoicism versus big S Stoicism, and the little. So I have a good friend who is definitely a little s Stoic.
Yeah.
And I know this for a fact, not because I you know, his behavior is clearly, you know, endurance. He's definitely not devoid of emotions or anything like that. It's stiff upper lip, but it is, his thing is endurance. He can endure a lot. And in fact, he has endured a lot in his life, more than I can, in fact, imagine. And he considers himself a Stoic in that sense. Right? It's like, oh, well, you know, what am I going to do? I mean, what am I going to complain about? This is the situation, I have to deal with it. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the story. But he's also very clear because, you know, he read actually my book, How to Be a Stoic, and he told me, well, I'm not a Stoic with a capital S. And the reason he's not a Stoic with a capital S is because he cannot buy into certain aspects that I think are fundamental of Stoic philosophies. For instance, cosmopolitanism. Okay. Right. Or this notion that the most important thing in life is you know, virtue and not externals and, you know, that sort of stuff. Therefore, he's not a Stoic with a capital S. But there is a sense in which he's a natural Stoic with the little s. And now it's interesting to me to see. This is obviously an empirical question. If in fact people that are Stoic with a little s may be more prone to then embrace the philosophy if they discover it, if they actually are exposed to it. Obviously not my friend, but nevertheless, because I hear, when I go to Stoicon, I hear often, oh, I've always been a Stoic. Like, wait, no, you couldn't possibly always be a Stoic because you didn't know about the philosophy and you did not know about the theory. But there's something in there, right?
Yeah, and I've seen people saying things like that in the Facebook discussion groups, which I still go to, although I'm getting close to the point of saying, yeah, I'm not going to bother with those anymore. Because there's so much, you know, there's so much that just, it's like reinventing the wheel over and over again. But there are a lot of people who say, you know, when I read this stuff, I responded to it because I've been thinking this way my whole life. You know, I guess we could say a couple things. One is there might be some ways in which one does that where it would naturally lead into at least some Stoic practices and insights and ideas. Right. But there might be some where it's going to be at odds with it. And it would actually make it more difficult for a person to embrace Stoicism with a capital S. The other thing I was wondering about, though, is do you think we should talk about people being, Stoicism not being like an on-off switch, you know, where either you're Stoic or you're not, but being something like you were saying, you know, your friend can accept certain tenets of classical Stoicism, right, but there's others that they can't. maybe it's sort of like the DSM for mental illness. You need to have like 7 in column A, and then you could qualify or something
Well,
like
that's
that.
a good question. I mean, and that actually brings me to one of the other topics that we wanted to discuss today, which is when people tell other people, "Oh, that's not Stoic, bad Stoic." It's like, hey, wait.
That's happened to you a lot.
Oh yes, it happens to me on Twitter almost every day. It's like, oh, that's bad Stoicism. Like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I'm pretty sure that it's bad Stoicism to tell other people that it's bad Stoicism. So
yeah, I think that's and why. Now that's something that I think is worth thinking about.
Yeah,
it shows a sort of. It's clearly an obsession with externals, right? Instead of worrying about one's own development, one looks for other people to criticize or to teach, or however we want to put it. And it's sort of like a busybodiness, which is going to be counterproductive. And it strikes me that a lot of people engaging in it, because I've tried to engage in conversations with some people doing that, they don't want to look very carefully at what they're doing or the assumptions of what they're doing.
Right. And in fact, Epictetus says pretty much explicitly that you shouldn't do that kind of busybodying, right? It says in the Enchiridion, there is a bit of, where he says, don't talk too much, especially about yourself.
Yeah.
Don't talk about gladiators and other things. So that's an easy one to follow in modern times. No gladiators around. But there is a number of places where in the Stoic text, so what they actually do say is like, this is not other people's behaviors, isn't your business. That's their issue. That's their problem. And of course, from Epictetus' perspective, the main reason for it is you don't control it. It's outside of your control.
Now that seems to raise a sort of paradox, though, right? Because then you say, well, who's to teach anything, right? And clearly, we don't want to just dispense with teaching or guidance altogether. We do want to say that like some people have attained more insight than others. We don't have to say that they're sages in the process. Right. So how do we hold on to that and yet say, don't be a busybody?
Oh, I have my way out, which is very self-serving. I say, the only exception is if you're a teacher. If you're a teacher, then of course you can tell. In fact, and Epictetus does that, right?
Yeah.
In the discourses, there are several places where the lector addresses his students and says, "You fool," or "You slave. What are you doing here?" Right? And in fact, he makes fun of them, or he criticizes them. But he's the teacher, and they're there on purpose, right? They're not. It's not like they're actually there to hear from him, to learn from him. It's not like he's going around randomly. In fact, there is a bit where he does say, "Oh, I used to go around the streets of Rome." Telling people what to think, and then somebody punched me on the nose, and that was the end of that one.
Now it's interesting that you bring up the teacher thing, because both you and I are teachers who have a lot of experience in the classroom, and we also have we've had a lot of peers over time, and we've also had our own professors, right, as we were coming up. Now, you can tell me whether your experience matches mine. I would say that about, maybe half of my colleagues are not very good teachers. And I wouldn't...
I think that's conservative.
I wouldn't really trust them to be guiding people about how to apply philosophy, even if they're philosophy professors. Yeah. So we don't want to just say, well, that being a teacher per se is the out for that, right? We'd still have to have, and some of them are in fact busybodies.
That's right. Sorts. I completely agree. So let me actually qualify this. This is a really important qualification. And then after this, I think I'm going to open it up for a first round of Q&A. So if you guys are interested in asking a question, just raise your virtual hand, not the real one, because I can't see everybody. There's 80, almost 90 people in the room, so I can't see everybody. But the virtual hand, I will be able to see it. So, but Greg, that's a very good point. So what I mean by teacher in this context, or even by philosopher, frankly, is somebody who is teaching or who is practicing philosophy in the way that we're talking about, not a licensed teacher by the state of New York, let's say. Right? And not even a philosopher in the sense of somebody with a PhD. I mean, you probably are familiar with these series of studies that I find very funny. They came out a few years ago that showed that professors in moral philosophy are not more ethical than your average academic, right?
Yeah. Although I was a bit worried about the way the study's set up and the proxy.
There are some methodological issues there.
But I do think it actually does, and to tell me whether you know, on your side, it certainly does map onto my experience, which is that my peers in ethics aren't particularly good people.
Right. And fortunately, the study didn't show that they were particularly bad people either. They're just, they're just on average. But so the first time, I remember actually distinctly, the first time that I read the study, the first study, because now there's been a number of them. First one, I said, oh, come on, this is a little bizarre. There might be some methodological issue, which you're right, there are. But nevertheless, when they were repeated over and over, it's like, okay, well, there's something that needs to be addressed here. And my first thought was, well, that's really odd. That's not the expectation, right? But then I thought, why not? Because in fact, teaching moral philosophy today has absolutely nothing to do with practicing the art of living. You don't get hired because you're Socrates or Epictetus. You get hired because you wrote a really highly technical thesis on a tiny little portion of what somebody else has said, probably centuries ago. So yeah, I wouldn't expect actually the two to match at all. And sure enough, they don't.
Yeah, it's not a surprise. And the curriculum too, there's so many people I know who their view on what ethics is well, you teach a little bit of utilitarianism and some Kant and some Aristotle for the virtue ethics, but you totally sanitize that and now you're done. Exactly. Do a couple cases and
exactly. Let's take the first question from Tim. Let me give him the mic. Tim, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned in passing the difference between constructive regret or anger and non-constructive, the passion type. Where would the line be between constructive, like regret or self-criticism, and like non-productive regret or anger?
I don't think that you can draw a, applying to everything sort of line. I think you can certainly say that some things are clearly way over on the side of that imaginary line, but this is where like the virtue of prudence would come in and help us to ask the right questions in a situation. So, Massimo was talking about anger as a response to injustice. And there might be some cases where the response that one feels, and we could use other terms too, being rightfully indignant or things like that, to seeing injustice taking place, maybe the response should be stronger in some cases and weaker in others, right? So for example, I'll just take one from our local state here. Wisconsin has made the news recently because of the shenanigans having to do with our governor imposing a stay-at-home order, which was very prudent and wasn't really that oppressive, and then being sued by the opposing party, which has been trying to hamstring him since he was elected, and going to the state Supreme Court, which is dominated by that party, and them just taking away the order altogether. Well, a lot of people were quite upset about that, including myself. And I think thinking about how many people are going to be placed in harm's way, it makes sense to feel some anger. But then the question is, well, what do you do with it? Right? As Seneca says, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Massimo to answer the rest of this. Seneca says anything that you can accomplish with anger, you can accomplish with rationality as well, and it's more reliable. And I think that's part of what you were talking about before. We don't just stick with the anger. Same thing with the regret. You don't want to wallow in not just self-pity. It's not really even self-pity. It's more like self-laceration. Mm-hmm. But you can say, well, is this actually constructive? Is this helping in any way, or do I need now to like turn it over? Pass it on to reason, which for Stoics is effective.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, what I like about Seneca's treatment of anger is exactly this distinction between, on the one hand, it may be a warning bell, and it certainly is unavoidable. You cannot avoid feeling the swelling of anger under certain situations, but you should never act on it. And I love the way he responds directly to Aristotle, because Aristotle actually talks about action, using anger in action. Not just as a warning bell. And Aristotle's example is, you want your soldiers to be a little bit angry when they go to battle, because then they fight better, and they're more willing to fight. Actually, he says.
Yeah.
And Seneca says, well, drunken soldiers are also a little bit more willing to fight, but that doesn't mean you want a drunken army. It's not a good idea. And in fact, that is interesting. There's some studies on modern fighters, in like pugilists in the ring, boxers, where the most effective ones are the ones that actually are able to maintain calm while getting the opponent angry. Because if you get your opponent angry, then the guy starts swinging, in random points and very, very wildly because he's angry. He does not control what he's doing, and so he's wasting energy and opening himself up. And then you can punch him. So there's some actually empirical evidence about that. That's
it's funny because Aristotle himself talks of, not in terms of boxing or anything, but he talks about that as a tactic in carrying out arguments with people. I think it's in On Sophistical Refutations. He talks about this technique of doing something that will tick off your opponents, so they'll become less effective and say stupid things.
Fascinating. All right, Jim is next. Jim, I believe you don't have the mic yet. Yes, you do have the mic now. Yes, go ahead.
Greg, you mentioned earlier that you think regret can be a good thing. And I wonder if that's something that necessarily can be true in the context of Stoicism, because regret is wishing that you had done something differently in the past, as opposed to remorse, which I think can be useful in hoping that you will do something differently in the future.
I don't see that distinction. I mean, there's a lot of ways of like trying to define the emotions. I don't see a lot of people talking about remorse as a future-oriented emotion. Usually it's like regret. It's about something in the past. But I think that it can be, so it's qualifiedly good, right? It's qualifiedly helpful. It would be better if you didn't feel it at all. But if you have screwed up, it's better to feel it than not to feel it, because then you can use it to help guide you to not doing that sort of thing again. Right. And again, Aristotle also says something similar with shame. He says, well, I can't call shame a virtue because you really shouldn't feel it at all. This is in the Nicomachean Ethics, book 4. But he talks about it in almost a counterfactual way, that you don't want people to be shameless and do things and then not feel any sort of, and what he's calling shame could be translated also as regret or remorse. You don't want them to do that, because then they're not going to see any significance to what they're doing. Being able to see the badness in what we've done can help us to, it can help us to do two things. One is to try to fix it, to remedy it or make up for it. And then the other is to see, to focus more closely on what's wrong with me that I keep doing these sorts of things,
Right. I'm going to take one more question right now, and then we'll go back to, because I want to cover a couple of other topics with Craig, and then we'll get back to questions hopefully a little later. So the next one is Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
Hey, Massimo. Hey, Greg.
Hey.
So Greg and I were actually having a conversation on Monday about certain things on this topic, and one is living in accordance to nature. So does that mean I should just, live in that like Darwin-esque idea of nature and the survival of the fittest here?
The nature red in tooth and claw, right?
Right.
That sort of thing. Or lobster nature.
Lobster nature, there you go.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll mention too, Dan, who you just seen, is my co-host for the Wisdom for Life show. That's what he was referring to. And we've talked about Stoicism so much that we decided to record an episode just on Stoicism that'll be coming out in the near future. So what do you think about in accordance with nature? I know what you say in your book.
Yeah. Well, so living according to nature, it's one of those fun, great taglines or bumper sticker things, which, however, I guess it would be a bumper chariot thing more than which is, it's a great phrase, but it does unfortunately open itself up to, lend itself to a bunch of misconceptions. The most common one being, oh yeah, so now everything that is natural is good. Well, that clearly is not the case. That would be an appeal to nature. It's an elementary logical fallacy, and the Stoics were a little better than that. They certainly, particularly Chrysippus was high up in the logic stuff. So that's clearly not what they mean, and it's actually very clear about what they mean. Because they do elaborate on it. My interpretation is that it means to focus on what are normatively the best aspects of human nature, the most fundamental and best aspect of human nature, which come down to be two aspects: our high degree of sociality, sociability, and our ability to reason. All right. So when Seneca says, virtue is simply right reason, and when Marcus Aurelius says, do what is reasonable for a social being, what they mean is you should use your brain power to improve society, to improve the human cosmopolis. That's what living according to nature, I interpret it to be. It definitely doesn't mean that anything that is natural is good. It's certainly not a preview of social Darwinism or anything like that. But what's your take? Did you have a
I think that's entirely right. And there were interpretations of it that are given in Aristotemus. There's like a whole passage where he's like, the Stoics say this, here's what all the different things they mean by in accordance with nature. The one thing I will say is that it is kind of a complicated topic when you start mapping out all the different references to it. Some of the things that they thought were in accordance with nature back then seem to be more culturally conditioned.
Yeah.
I don't think we all have to have beards. Obviously, Massimo, you're in a terrible condition, and
Absolutely.
mine is pretty short.
Yeah.
I'm looking around at all the people.
Your beard looks a little bit too suspiciously Aristotelian. It's a little too well kept.
Well, I let it grow out, so Epictetus would be happy, right?
But not too much, otherwise you become a cynic. And
it starts to get wild. It's unruly, and so then I get tired of it, and then I trim it, and then it takes a while to grow back out again. But the going back to in accordance with nature, I like that you point out that it really does have to do with our social nature. And you could think of it as now the Stoics don't say this, but living in accordance with nature is sort of transforming our animality. We're the rational animal, and we have all these drives that other animals have. And we do, in fact, this is why I was joking a little bit about lobsters, and that's obviously a reference to Jordan Peterson. But he talks about these dominance hierarchies. Okay, those do exist, and those don't have to be our destiny, though. And so what it means to live in accordance with nature is to sometimes trim off some of this stuff and wean ourselves away from it, right?
In fact, Peterson does commit, or that comes very close to committing, the appeal to nature fallacy, because he's basically saying, our hierarchies are natural, therefore, what are you complaining about? Or gender roles are natural, therefore, was like, and no, therefore nothing. Nothing much follows from that.
And that's actually a great segue into another sort of thing that we wanted to talk about, which is like Stoicism and the red pill and the sort of like anti-feminism stuff. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, the Stoics weren't the first philosophers to say men and women basically have the same capacities. Plato says that in the Republic. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, he doesn't even think that men and women all have exactly the same capacities. He talks about some of us, being more thumatic than others, and he says women can be just as thumatic as men, they can be just as rational as men, they can be just as appetitive as men. So you got to figure out where people fit into the society. But it seems pretty clear that Zeno thought that men and women ought to be treated the same. I'm really glad that we have Musonius Rufus telling us that both men and women need to be trained in virtue to the same degree, and that a genuine marriage is not the guy on top and the woman on the bottom, but it's a meeting of equals.
Yeah. And there's an interesting mix of, as you would expect, of course, between the principles that I think are in fact entailed by the philosophy, congruent with the philosophy, and then the influence of the local customs of the time. Yeah. Like take Seneca. Seneca is great for this because it's not unusual if you read Seneca from a modern perspective to cringe a little bit, because he often says, you don't want to be a woman about this. You don't want to, that's
Epictetus too.
And Epictetus as well. It's like, this is a woman thing kind of thing. But then in the letter of consolation to Marcia, he says explicitly, you think that I'm telling you these things that I shouldn't be talk to you like this because you're a woman. But in fact, it's clear that women have the same capacity for philosophy, etc. And he says the same thing to his own mother, Elvia, when he says, I wish that my father had allowed you to, pursue philosophy because you clearly have the ability to do so. So when I see these kind of contradictions, I think it's reasonable. I don't think it's, in any way begging the question or acting in a sort of selective way. It's reasonable to try to separate what might have been the local custom, the local way of saying things, and so on and so forth, which we obviously need to discard because we don't live 2,000 years ago or in ancient Rome, from what actually is entailed by the philosophy. And the philosophy, as you were saying, clearly states that it's cosmopolitan. And we're all human beings. If we share in the logos, if we're capable of rationality, then we're all on the same level, on the same plane. So that clearly is the philosophy. Then whether Epictetus or Seneca, occasionally slip up and talk about, don't be a woman. That's why I actually, when I quote them, I actually take those passages away because they distract from or even rewrite them. Because they're just distracted.
I do a similar thing when I translate passages from the Greek or Latin, and I don't just do this for the Stoics. Anthropos, I don't like to translate as man. I translate it as human being or person, or so we don't wind up excluding people. Going back to the sort of red pill thing, I think you've seen a lot of this where people appropriated Stoicism and they focused very much on this notion of virtue, but they really left out the temperance and wisdom and justice parts just to focus on what they took as fortitude,
right?
And they would construe that as manliness then,
right? Exactly. And then they point out the funny thing is that when people want to be experts and they're not, right? So it's ver, the Latin ver means that's true, but you do know that the Latin verb was a translation of arete, which doesn't mean man at all. It means excellence of a human being as a human being. So what are you doing here? You're picking and choosing whatever you like. I do find the Broisism, as sometimes it's referred to, the red pill, Stoicism, problematic. But at the same time, I kind of expect that sort of stuff to be a byproduct of the success of Stoicism, right? I mean, just like other religions or philosophies then get distorted, and once they become popular, they get distorted and used for. I mean, think about. In the case of Christianity, the prosperity gospel. I mean, if there is anything that is non-Christian, it's the prosperity gospel.
And there's a similar red pill thing happening with Christianity too, like a super stress on the Crusades, and the whole use of the term Deus Vult as like kind of a code word, and but I mean a reading of the Gospels would, I think. Not just skimming one's eyes over it, but actually thinking it through, taking the Sermon on the Mount seriously, would probably militate against that. Yeah.
Exactly. And the same goes for Stoicism. Besides, Stoicism, as we were saying earlier, does have an advantage over Christianity, let's say. That is, we don't think of Epictetus as God, and the Enchiridion is not scripture. So, okay. I mean, the other day, somebody actually pointed out to me a really interesting little passage that I neglected in the Discourses, where Epictetus seemed to invoke a notion of self-deception as sometimes useful. And this was in the context of a completely different discussion about William James' will to power. So I didn't remember. So I actually went and checked that particular passage. And I'll share it with you after the show. And so you let me know what you said. And sure enough, it does seem to say something along those lines. I'd rather be deceiving myself into, a virtuous behavior than it's like, okay, but then I thought, but why would you deceive yourself into virtuous behavior? If you understand the philosophy, you don't need to deceive yourself. But whatever it is, and whatever it meant, fine. My response this was on Twitter, my response was, well, lucky for me, I don't think of the Discourses as scripture. So if Epictetus says that and meant that, too bad for Epictetus. That's the end of the story at that point.
And we could also say sometimes people do have to be like cajoled or deceived or tricked into doing something that's good for them because they can't recognize it at the time.
Right.
And then after they start practicing, they can turn back at that and say, "Oh man, I was dummy. I didn't actually need that to get in here. Well, I needed it, but one doesn't need it, and now I can get rid of that."
Right. Let's pause for a second. Take a couple more questions. Let's see who is next. Joseph is next. Go ahead, Bart.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for the presentation today. I very much appreciate it. Both of you taking the time today. My question is fairly simple. It's, Stoicism is, basically, living in accordance with nature. Virtue is its own reward, and it makes us good citizens. But would it be improper if I were talking to someone and explaining it to say that it's a way of becoming self-aware? Would that misrepresent it in any way, shape, or form? I know that Stoicism, obviously, by understanding what is in your control and not in your control, then you're becoming more self-aware. But would it be misrepresenting it if I were to say to someone directly, this is a way of becoming self-aware?
I don't think so. As a matter of fact, the only way in which it would be is if you said it's only a way of becoming self-aware.
Right.
And one of the things that we were going to talk about is the tendency to oversimplify Stoicism. There's a great letter by Seneca where Lucilius asks them, hey, give me some quotes. And they're called maxims, of course, in the translation. But and Seneca begs off by saying, first off, Stoicism doesn't really work that way. It's not just a bunch of little tiny bits and pieces. It's this, complex system where all of these things fit together. And then he says, and if I was going to try to give you any quotes, it would be a futile thing to do because they're all just as good as the next one. And you notice, like, the Discourse is a very long book, and Seneca writes some quite long books as well. So this notion that Stoicism is basically just this, and this, those are sort of like entry points. Think of them as like doors, right? And then you're in this gigantic edifice. That's kind of like a medieval cathedral. There's all of this stuff, and you look around, and if you come in for just a while, it's like when we could go into Notre Dame before it burned down.
Yeah.
There's lots of other tourists in the way, and you can only see so much at one given point. But if you're spending time with it day in, day out, you'd obviously come to appreciate the complexity of the cathedral more. So I don't see any problem with telling somebody Stoicism is this when it really is that in part, provided you're not saying it's really only this. You're not making it exclusive.
Right. Yeah, because self-awareness, I think then you need to qualify it, because it depends on what you mean by self-awareness. Do you mean the biological function that we are aware of being some? Obviously not. There's something more to it. But yes, I do think that self-awareness is reasonably part of it. Yeah. Mark is next. Oops. Mark. I don't know if you can talk, Mark. Mark is on the phone, so that may be a problem. Yeah, I don't think that I can get Mark. So let's go to the next one, at least not for now, who'll be Oz, AWS.
Hey.
Yes.
So Epictetus mentions that our body is outside of our control, and lately I've learned that our stomach and our hearts have neurons, so they can think, they can feel, and they can take action on their own. And our brain does the same thing. So where does our rational mind lies then?
Yeah, that's a great question. Greg, you want to get started?
No, I don't want to turn that one over to you because you have the much more extensive background in this sort of thing.
I'll give it a first crack then. I think that even the Stoics were aware. Obviously, they had no knowledge of modern cognitive science, neurobiology, and et cetera, right? But they were clearly aware of the fact that some of our mental life is actually not under our control. This is kind of implicit in Epictetus. It's actually explicit in Seneca, because when he says, you don't control your anger, for instance, you cannot stop it. That means because you have these feelings and these thoughts that are autonomic. They come to you automatically. You don't control them. And so I think that the Stoics and Epictetus especially insist on the fact that the part you control is only your deliberate, whatever it is you deliberate on. So your prohairesis, your little, yourself is basically just limited to a tiny part of what we consider you. It's not the body, and it's not even the entire brain. For one thing, the Stoics, of course, the ancient Stoics thought that actually the side of the seat of the prohairesis was the heart, not the brain. They were wrong on that. There's one thing that they were definitely wrong about.
Galen bought that too, though, right? So
what was that?
Galen bought that.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, that's right. And Galen actually at some point it did actually correct and in fact made fun of some of the Stoics because of it. But so the point is, they even they were aware that even the mental life is definitely not entirely under our control. Now, modern research confirms that to a large extent. And in fact, the part that counts as above the surface, and it's the kind of stuff that we actually have we can deliberate on, it's actually fairly small. It's what the Daniel Kahneman, his famous book about thinking fast and slow, calls slow thinking. The slow thinking is, or the system two, I forgot which one is system one and which one is system two, but anyway, one of the two systems is the one that allows you to deliberate, to slow down, and to take things into account. But most of the time, we actually think with the other system, with the fast one. We just react to stuff. And then you can actually see part of Stoic training, a major goal of Stoic training, as in allowing you to slow down. And when Epictetus says, look at this impression and don't just act on it, right? And so don't just do it. Slow down and think about it, and it will turn out that more likely than not, you actually don't want to do it. But in order to arrive at that deliberation, you do have to slow down. So there was some kind of intuition that we react too fast to things. Now, that said, there are modern skeptics, not in the sense of the ancient philosophy at all, but let's say people like Jonathan Haidt, for instance, who is a social psychologist, who's been writing a number of papers and books arguing that essentially, we're just on the illusion that we control anything at all. In reality, we rationalize all the time, and even our rational thinking, even our deliberate thinking, it's actually a bunch of rationalizations. I think he's going too far there. First of all, he's going too far even just on the basis of the evidence, but also it's kind of, if you actually follow him all the way there, then it becomes a self-contradictory proposition, because why should I believe Jonathan Haidt since he's also rationalizing all the time anyway? Now he does have a point that we do even our rational thinking, a lot of it is in fact rationalizing, and in fact the evidence is clear that the smarter and more educated a person is, the better they are at rationalizing their own position. Whatever they want to do, they can come up with all sorts of reasonable excuses for doing it. But again, I would actually push back and say that a big part of Stoic training is not only to slow down, but to improve your faculty of judgment, right? To counter our natural ability to rationalize, of which I think the Stoics were actually aware, at least at an intuitive level. At least that would be my take on that sort of stuff. Greg, why don't we talk about this notion that there are some, which we kind of been dancing around, this notion that there are some ideas that are, that there is a single idea that it's core to Stoicism, and then other parts are dispensable. What's going on there in your opinion?
I see this happening a lot in the discussion boards about Stoicism, where people want to say, it's the dichotomy of control and everything else doesn't matter, and that's just not the case. If that was what Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius thought, they would have written very short books. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't have been books. They would just be there in Diogenes Laertes as people who had single quips. And I think that some people, they might say, oh, that's fine. Those old guys wrote that stuff, but now we're in, the modern period. Now we can boil it down and we can simplify it and make it, just maybe 7 principles or, 3 principles or something like that. And Stoicism isn't the only approach that people have tried to do that with, but it never really works well. Because reality is complicated and the human mind is incredibly complicated. And so we need many principles and many practices just to get a handle on it. And I don't see why we would want to throw away all the stuff that we were fortunate enough to have. I mean, we've lost, Donald and I at one point, Donald Robertson and I, we sat down and we tried to figure out how much of Stoic literature do we probably possess. And his take, I think he said something like 11%. You know, and I was like, that's
very precise.
Yeah, well, and a lot of it was Seneca, you know, because Seneca, we have so much more of him than we have of others. And it might be 20%, it might be 5%, but clearly we don't have most of what they wrote. So what we do have, we really do want to hold on to and make as much use out of as we can.
Yeah, no, I agree. The notion also of sort of well, let me rephrase it this way. One of the things that I moved to the United States a long time ago now, like, you know, more than a quarter century. But one of the things that struck me as interesting about sort of the American ethos, to some extent, is that there are a number of phrases that are typically American and I never hear in Europe, such as the bottom line, a silver bullet, you know, at the end of the day, and all these kind of like this tendency to just like put it down into a very short list of things that are actionable right here, right now, and that's it, done. The European approach tends to be a little bit more, no, actually it's complex. I mean, Umberto Eco famously said, you know, there's always a simple answer to every complex question is usually wrong. You know, that's the problem with simple answers. So I completely agree with you. I don't think we should try to boil down things. That's another phrase.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's a tradition. It's a philosophical tradition that is very rich, and as you say, it's too bad that we lost probably 90% of it already. So why would you want to, on purpose, throw away the rest or most of the rest? So just that it fits on whatever list of predetermined numbers is always 7 or 10 or 3, you know, something like that, because those are the preferred numbers of from people. No, let's talk about what these ideas are. Sure, some ideas might be more useful than others today. Some of them might be more fundamental in a sort of philosophical sense to, you know, the entire the overall architecture of Stoicism. But to reduce it to just one thing and then get rid of it, it seems like weird. However, I do have a question for you related to this. So I've been in an on and off discussion with Chuck, the editor of the Stoic magazine. And
we
he
published some of that in Stoicism today,
right. And he's been in a really long discussion on a platform called Letter Wiki with Tim Leban about the same topic. I think they exchanged something like almost 20 letters about this stuff. So here's the thing: what he calls Stoic minimalism, right? So he thinks that, he argues that essentially the only thing we need is ethics. The other two components of the Stoic system, that is physics, meaning natural science and metaphysics, and logic, meaning not only logic, but cognitive science and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, they're just like, they're out of the way, and you know, they're not needed. Essentially, that position has been actually proposed in the history of Stoicism, for instance, by Aristotle before, you know, so one of the very early Stoics. Yeah. And sure enough, he left the school at some point because people started pointing out to him that, well, essentially what you're talking about is cynicism, not Stoicism anymore. So what's your take on that? What is it that we should retain in terms of, because it's on the one hand, so this was Chuck's position, but on the other hand, I do understand, of course, and agree that there are certain parts, especially Stoic physics, that are not acceptable nowadays, right? Stoic logic is fine, because Stoic logic is propositional logic, and propositional logic is perfectly, fine today. We don't actually need any more than that. We don't need advanced types of logic to deal with day-to-day problems. It can be integrated with cognitive science, with findings from cognitive science, etc. But it's an integration. It's not a rejection. On the other hand, the metaphysics. Yeah, I don't believe that the universe is a living organism endowed with the logos. So yeah, that part has to go as far as I'm concerned. But does that mean that we should reject the entire notion that metaphysics is irrelevant?
No, I don't think we should reject all of the metaphysics. I mean, some of the things that the Stoics are saying about the nature of substance is quite interesting and might be plausible. But to the logic part, right? So the logic does include what we these days call logic, but it also includes what they were calling dialectic back then, which is processes of inquiry and how to sort of carry things out. I think it would also include what we nowadays call epistemology, and I think you could argue it also includes semiotics. So. Yes. It's a pretty wide range, and I don't see any reason why we'd throw it out. And Epictetus has a great response to this. You know, there's a chapter, you know this, where he's got a student who's got this very practical, I don't need to learn, I just need to learn the ethics part. I don't need the logic part. And he says, well, go ahead and try that. And then when you come crying back to me about how you got, you know, bamboozled by somebody who, you know, seduced you with an argument, I guess you're going to start studying logic then. And there's this tendency, there's a little bit of a digression. There's this tendency in Epictetus that I don't think is there in Seneca and isn't there in Marcus Aurelius and definitely isn't there in Musonius Rufus, where Epictetus is like willing to say to his students, listen, if you think you're smarter than the Stoics, try your nonsense out, see where it gets to you, and then we'll, you know, after you've got it out of your system, we'll come back and talk about this.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. My take on what we should do today in terms of sort of the physics, the logic, and the ethics is that what is important is to retain the kernel of the original idea. And I think the kernel of the original idea wasn't this particular physics or this particular aspect of logic. It was the notion that in order to live a good life, you ought to know the best that there is to know out there about how the world works, because if you are profoundly misled about how the world works, you're not going to likely live a good life. And you ought to know, you ought to reasonably think, you know, you have to be able to think reasonably about stuff. Otherwise, you're going to both misinterpret the physics and not live, you know, in a good, you know, not understand a good ethics. That, I think, is the kernel. So this notion that an understanding of the world, a general understanding of the world, not a specialized one, but a general understanding of the world and a general ability to think correctly are fundamental. Otherwise, you find yourself living an ethics that is entirely derived from other people's opinions, and it's not your thing. You don't own it.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. I don't know that I have too much to add on that particular topic.
Well, luckily, we have only a few minutes left, and we've got a couple of other questions. So why don't we try Tim?
Hi.
Yes.
You were mentioning before about not being a busybody and providing entry points for people for Stoicism. I was wondering, how could we, you know, console or help someone or try to introduce our friends to Stoicism without sounding preachy, without being a busybody?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is.
I think part of it is, you know, don't place too much stress on any one single interaction. So you suggest to them, hey, this has been helpful for me, and then you kind of leave it at that. And if they respond to it and they ask questions, now you've got an opening, but you don't follow up and like nag at them or anything. Because if they're already having a rough time, they don't need you, helping them out in that way if they're not ready to hear it. And, you know, this comes up a lot. Like I have, you know, Massimo, I think you could talk about this too. I have kids who are teenagers, and I see the struggles that they go through, and I know that some of the things that we study could be helpful for them, but trying to suggest anything to a teenager is often counterproductive. So you have to, like, you know, they have to see some sort of gain on their part in order for them to take it on. And so, you know, just by acting in that way, they see me sitting around reading it, they know that I take it seriously. They're a little bit more prone to then be open to it, but only a little bit more.
Yeah.
And so if you've got a friend or a family member that you want to reach, or a colleague, you know, somebody at work who you see is struggling, you know, I think sort of a soft touch approach is the way to go.
Yeah, and I agree. And one way to do the soft touch approach is to actually not mention necessarily the Stoics, at least not at the beginning. So you know, I learned that unless it's a different context like this one, obviously we're talking about Stoicism, right? But if it is a neutral context where I don't expect people necessarily to be familiar with Stoicism or to be particularly interested in Stoicism, then I might bring up a notion, a concept, without saying, you know, Epictetus says, because Epictetus says it doesn't say much to a lot of people, and also it may be a turnoff. But if you say, so you know, I heard about this notion that, you know, that it's useful to focus on things that are under your control, where your agency is maximized, and then to try to develop an attitude acceptance over the rest. It's like, oh, really? Where does that come from? Because that sounds very much like a serenity prayer. I know, right? But actually, it turns out, it goes back 2,000 years, blah blah, and now you're into a conversation. So I don't think never start by quoting scripture. Basically, that's what I'm suggesting. It's like, oh, as Marcus Aurelius says, no, that's probably counterproductive, and it's too bad because people can benefit from the Stoic insight, and it may not, the direct approach might not necessarily be the best one, unless again people ask you that. I mean, now for these days, for me, it's almost impossible to pretend that I'm not practicing Stoic. Everybody that approaches me knows.
You've been
exactly.
outed, yeah.
Yeah, I've been outed, so it's like, whatever. Look, we got maybe a couple more minutes. One more question from Mark.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, first, thank you very much. This has been awesome. My question concerns the dichotomy of control. If you were to consider two people practicing Stoicism, one of them says, that's out of my control, there's nothing I can do anyway. And the second person says, they're going to do everything within their power. I was wondering if you would consider it a misunderstanding of Stoicism to kind of hide behind it to not act.
Yes, definitely. As a matter of fact, in ancient times, there was something called the idle argument that Cicero talks about in On Faith.
Right.
And there's all sorts of examples of it today where somebody will say like, well, the doctor prescribed this medicine for me, but it's not really in my control. I'm either going to get better or I'm not going to get better, so I won't take the medicine. Right.
Right. And sure enough, you're not likely to get better.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's a lot of things like that we can say. Just because something is out of our control doesn't mean that we shouldn't orient ourselves towards it. Like Epictetus says, the use of indifference is something that is in our control. The attitude we take towards it, or whether we try to at least do our best in relation to it. But then, we realize that, ultimately those things are not entirely up to us, and they can go counter to whatever expectations we might have.
That's right. All right, Greg, this has been a pleasure. It's been
likewise.
More than an hour. If you don't mind, I'll invite you again at some point because this looks like we have lots of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, it sounds like a great idea.
Great. Everybody, thanks for coming and joining us today. Remember, next week we're going to have John Sellers and the Art of Living, so that should be fun as well, or at least interesting and informative. And other than that, yeah, it's my version of fun might be different from other people's. In the meantime, stay safe and try to get over the pandemic as best as you can. Bye-bye.